we recording? Yes. Okay. Cool. So it is recording, and it does look like it is subtitling to the best of its ability. Certain platforms are better at this than others. YouTube is the worst in my experience, at least with my voice. Um, Others, I don't know. Maybe I don't enunciate enough. I don't have any vocal training, so that might be why. Yes, we will record. I will put it up on my YouTube. I will send out that link to everybody after. So anything that anyone misses, they can catch up on and get in contact with us as needed. So welcome to Pipeline to Publication, a journal of sound and music and games mentorship workshop. I'm Dana Plank. I'm the editor in chief. And we can just we have our editorial team here. So let's go alphabetically. Will.
Hi, I'm Will Ayers. I'm an associate editor, and I teach at the University of Central Florida.
Excellent. Karen Cook.
Hey folks, Karen Cook here. I'm also associate editor and I am associate professor and chair of music history and director of graduate studies at the Hart School, the University of Hartford in Connecticut.
And Stephanie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Lind. I teach at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, Canada, and I'm a music theorist. I'm also one of the associate editors. Nice to see some familiar faces in the room.
Yeah, so exciting. So I do have the participant window up, but we'll all just keep an eye if we see folks pop into the waiting room here. Um, OSU has that turned on by default, so and I think the passcode and everything, I didn't have a way to not do that. I used to be able to set whether I wanted it to have a passcode. Anyway, um, so the team has been having pretty regular meetings as we sort of get our footing with the journal. We took over about this time last year in October, and it's been really interesting to sort of watch, things already in pipeline and trying to keep things moving along and just all the processes with the press and all of that. And one thing that is really important to all of us is the idea of mentorship and sort of working with our authors for development of the material. And this was something that got brought up months ago as a neat idea to kind of tack on to existing workshops that have been done. So one of the models was the workshop on much better abstract tactics, which we affectionately, or I should say Pete Smucker coined the term wombat for that. And I ran that as a way to sort of help the abstracts for the North American Conference on Video Game Music to be better. I don't know, to be strong, to sort of help folks realize what some of the best practices are and what people look for. So we had that idea to sort of present a number of topics. So here is our agenda for today. First up, we're going to discuss conference and seminar papers versus articles and what are the differences between them? How do we transition from one to the other? Next, we will go through the specific JSMG publishing process, pipeline, timeline, so folks get a sense of what that looks like. Best practices for things like citations, examples, alt text, abstracts. Common mistakes we see and issues with submissions that could slow time to publication. So if you're kind of aware of them in advance, you may have a smoother ride with fewer revise and resubmits, or just even an accept on a first go. Who knows? It could go really well. And then finally, building out your network and collaboration, which is near and dear to my heart and the hearts of many in this organization. So, all right. Here's our first section. So, conference and seminar papers versus articles. First one, obviously, length. Um, they can vary depending, of course, on how long your time is. If you get accepted to speak in a 10-minute lightning talk versus an hour keynote or a longer session, this could vary quite a bit. But depending on how quickly you speak and musical examples that you might play, videos of gameplay that you might play, you can expect about 1,200 to 3,000 words, maybe more, maybe less. Depending on how quickly you speak. And you don't want to pack it in too much. That's kind of a classic thing for early student papers is like you really want to put in as much as possible, but it is so much better for everybody else if you don't bowl them over by speaking a mile a minute, right? Giving words time to settle, taking a breath, taking a glass of water, playing an example, do a little more with less, let people tease things out in Q&A. When you go to turn that into an article, though, the Journal of Sound and Music and Games runs anything from 4,000 words to 10,000 word articles. And I believe it's 4 to 7. My team can correct me on this. Is it 4 to 7 and 7 to 10? We have a distinction between a longer and shorter form, but it's kind of internal. I don't think it really matters to anybody else. So I usually just tell everyone the full range, 4 to 10. And that is inclusive of footnotes, but not bibliography, which is a helpful thing to be aware of. Of course, a lot of footnotes will have bibliographic citations in them, but that is just for kind of main body of stuff with footnotes. Okay. Next up is language and tone. So when you're presenting a paper in an academic setting, of course you are trying to be polished and professional, and yet there is often a more conversational or colloquial tone. There's more accessible language. There's a lot of showing versus necessarily telling everything, because you do have the ability to play things live for an audience. And so you don't have to necessarily unpack everything that's going on in a musical example. You can play it first, or just kind of walk us through the main things to listen for and then play it. So there's a little bit more show and tell here. Oh, yes, thank you. So yes, 4 to 7,000 words, and then standard length. I don't think that makes any distinction. Like I wouldn't claim it any differently on a CV, for example. I don't know. Would anybody else claim that differently on a CV? Yeah. I think it's more for our internal purposes. We technically have a word count, like a page count for the entire volume in a given year. If we go over, they fine us. So it's like we haven't done it yet, but I have to be at least a little bit aware of it. So I have a little document that Elizabeth and Tim gave me where we just keep a running, like, here's how many pages are in this volume so far. So if we have ones that are like 10,000 words for every single article, that may shape how many we put in a given volume. So that's more on our end than you. But yeah, a lot of chapters for collected volumes are going to be 6K. You're right. Absolutely. And of course, depending on your institution, a peer-reviewed versus an invited contribution could count for more. So journal publishing can be very, very strategic and useful in especially early career when you're building a dossier or, applying for things. So, all right. Language and tone. So conversational language, more accessible versus more polished academic prose. I think that explains itself. I don't imagine anybody has too much question on that, but certainly the paper that you might hand in at the end of a seminar is going to be on that more polished side, whereas when you speak it, you can kind of take some liberties. And also I think there can be a bit of playing to the audience that happens in both as well. So if I'm talking at the American Musicological Society, I may need to explain a little bit more about video games to that audience, right? Yeah, I see some nods of recognition. And one of the examples I love to give, because it is just so heartwarming, is my own advisor on my dissertation didn't know what a video game boss was. And so I was explaining to him, we were talking about Mega Man, I think. And so I was saying how the level loops are longer than the loop that plays while you fight the boss. And he goes, "What is a boss?" And I sort of didn't know how to answer. I didn't understand how to answer the question. I'm like, well, you get to the end and you fight him and then you go to the next level. Like I wasn't quite sure where to go with it. And he goes, an adversary. Yes. Yes, an adversary. So I might need to explain, what is a boss? What is, I don't know, speed running? Some of these terms that a gamer is going to be pretty aware of, or even certain major franchise games. They may need a little bit of a primer on things like Mario and Zelda, especially specific entries in those franchises. Whereas we can do a lot more shorthand and assume that most folks are pretty familiar with a Zelda game versus writing on an indie title that maybe isn't as well known. I might do a little bit more explaining the plot, the mechanics of an indie game than I would for a franchise title in a paper, and it can save time. So you play to your audience in both. But certainly the more polished academic prose might err on the side of sort of doing a little bit of explanation of everything versus going, well, I can cut that for time, right? They don't need to hear, what an action RPG is. But you might have a footnote of that in a more polished paper. All right. Of course, citations are a big difference. So usage of citations and footnotes. I'm curious how many folks, when you give a conference talk, do you put footnotes in for yourself? I do. I do a little bit. Yeah. I find it useful. Where I tend to do it is maybe I will write more than I need and I know I need to cut down to fit the time. And so I will then pull stuff and throw it in a footnote. And that way, if somebody asks me about it, it's right there and I can just kind of go back and answer the question kind of from jogging my memory from the footnote. So I'll use it as a placeholder for things that I may then bring back in when I go to turn it into a publication. But I may at least have a kind of a short form citation for myself. I'm going to have a bibliography that I will generally share as a couple final slides, or sometimes a lot of us do like a QR code to a document saying, here's my bibliography if you'd like to see it. So you're still building a bibliography anyway, but the actual footnotes are not going to typically have that full polished Chicago style footnote citation. It may just be like, uh, Gibbons, unlimited replays, page number, just so I have a sense. So yeah, I think everybody kind of develops. That's a personal style thing, especially when no one else is going to see it but you. Formatting on conference papers is always really interesting to see, like, how do people put stage directions in for themselves? How do you indicate that you want to move to the next PowerPoint slide? Do you use a little, emoji or an image, or just put click, or whatever, next slide, advance. That's always kind of fun to see. So obviously all of that has to get taken out and changed over to the other format if we're adapting from something we have given. So more thorough citations, use of footnotes, working in imagery and examples. So we said this already, kind of we need to tell more than show in these cases. I had a really great moment with a grad student I was working with over the summer who gave a paper to us, and we had been kind of workshopping it together. And they asked me, how, if I have the musical example, because I'm a theorist and I put everything in these musical examples, they're very beautifully labeled, it's a whole thing. How much do I need to unpack that in the text? Because to me, it's right there. Shouldn't that be in place of having to tell about it? And the answer is it kind of depends on your peer reviewers, right? Some folks want to still see a good amount of unpacking. The alt text is going to need to explain what's in the image to some extent. But the content of that type of thing is going to vary. So one that's actually going to print here for the first issue of next year by Ryan Thompson, for example, he's talking about timbre a lot. And so a lot of his musical examples are kind of relating to that. And he actually had audio examples, was asking me about, do I need to be saying like what the chord progression is, or, what the melody is doing when I'm talking about timbre? I said, no, I would prefer your alt text be descriptive of the timbres of these things, since that's what you're talking about. So the show and tell is a bit of a push pull, and a bit of a feel that you kind of get used to for how much do I need to set this up versus trust that my musical audience understands this. They read music, they can parse this themselves. So I'm curious. My other three folks here, Karen, of course, wears both hats as musicology and theory. but all three of these folks are theorists. I'm curious what you guys think on the like show versus tell when it comes to a musical example.
Yeah, I can maybe start in on that. The one of the things that I've often been told when writing papers for other publications as well as this one is to be explicit about what you're seeing, to be able to walk the reader through the steps of following through your analysis. Theory examples can be really, really dense, so it helps to really have that prose to walk your reader through step by step by step. It can make the difference between somebody getting like really lost while reading your paper as opposed to being able to understand the flow of what's happening pretty easily.
Yeah, I think for me, my rule of thumb is any example, table, score, whatever you have, ought to be explained in the text. And the caption also has to clearly explain what the example is, such that if we were only looking at the examples, you would know what that is and maybe have a gist of what it is that the article then or the chapter is trying to do. And I don't think this is specific to our journal. I think this is something that is reasonably important for a conference paper on a slide, for example, or in any publication, no matter what the nature or who it's for. I think that an example ought to have a purpose. It ought to be necessary for the argument, and it ought to be clearly explained. Full stop.
And I don't have too much to add other than to say if people might have questions about, how much description should I give for this? Throwing one of us an email or throwing a friend who's a theorist an email, I'm sure we would all be very willing to kind of go back and forth and say, this is probably the level of description that you need in a certain paragraph or a certain instance. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, because the immediate conversation with the one student was, if I just explain it, then do I eliminate the need for the image? Like, can I over-explain such that peer reviewers or an editor is going to look at this and say, why is this example even in here? And, to which I say, no matter how much you over describe, musical notation is different and conveys different pieces of information than just a verbal description of what's happening. So I think it's nice because it's multimodal. It allows folks kind of multiple ways of apprehending what's happening, especially if there is a link to an audio example as well, and all of those things are being used in tandem with each other. This is kind of good pedagogy. It's common in disability studies to talk about multimodality as being more accessible as well. So it helps folks follow along with the content. So useful. We'll come back to more on this later for sure. One that I remember got brought up in our planning session for this was having a developed conclusion. So a conference paper could be something that you are kind of just starting. Early on, I didn't propose anything I hadn't yet written. So I usually started with a seminar paper that had been the final paper for a course I had taken, and then I proposed an abstract out of that. As I got more comfortable, I started realizing, okay, here's kind of how much baseline research I need before I feel ready to put something in front of people. You can do it too early. You can do it before it's really ready. But at the same time, there's a bit of play here where you could have something where it's fairly new work, where you are a little more preliminary in your conclusion, and you are partially using the conference space to workshop it a little bit to get some feedback, some good questions that could help you shape it a little more, or find your focus, or sometimes the thing that initially interests you about it isn't as interesting as something you uncover. That's one of my favorite examples ever. My chapter in the RPG book had like kind of a different bent, and Steve Reale said the interesting thing that isn't the thing you think it is, it's this other thing. Restructure the whole paper around this, and I think we have something. And so that can happen as well. So you can have these kind of preliminary conclusions. You can have a more exploratory sort of approach to what you're doing. And maybe you just write a really good abstract, but it's not like it's fully formed. Here it is. I'm presenting my conclusion and it's done. And so At that point, when you're then turning it around into an article, you're going to need to make sure that we now have that developed conclusion and that, we're taking it somewhere. There's nothing that raises an eyebrow faster for me than when I see somebody presenting the same paper in multiple places without substantive changes, especially if you're doing it, conferences kind of back to back. Update it a little bit, like take what you've taken. Maybe it's too late to rewrite the abstract, but I like to see it kind of, start to take on a new shape. And then certainly if you then submit it to the journal, and it's exactly the form that it was delivered as a conference paper, that could lead to a bit of a slower process as folks try to sort of make you go back in and polish it up a little more.
I wonder if I might chime in there for a sec. Do you mind, Darren?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, one of the other things I can say, sort of having been on the opposite side of this now for a year and seeing the articles coming in, and I've experienced this in my own writing as well, is the idea that conferences, you've always got the time constraint, right? Like you're really trying to fit everything in your 20 minutes in terms of what you want to give. And as a result of that, oftentimes you're giving very, very short versions of the previous scholarship that you're actually building your work on. This is one of the things I think that is one of the big differences between conference papers and journal submissions. Is in the journal, you've got time to go through and talk about that previous work and talk about how it then builds into your own. So rather than just kind of name dropping, you can really dig into the ideas and find ideas that connect to your own work.
That's a great point. And then if you're me, you try to triangulate so many different literatures in your lit review that you have your dear friends say, there's some of you in here too. Like, you don't only have to do lit review. So I have to temper myself a lot. And I think that comes out of insecurity and wanting to be like, look, I did my due diligence. I read 1,000 pages for this article, right? You can cut stuff, right? You can allude. You don't have to quote everything. You may want to. So that's a process in itself. But that's such a good point that you have to sort of leave behind so much lit review in particular to kind of get to your point in a paper. Absolutely. Okay. And then, all of this is to say, thinking of conference papers, seminar papers, as something that is workshopping toward publication in another forum. So really listen to Q&A, think about things that are brought up, have conversations with folks between sessions, take notes even. I'll take notes on what gets asked in Q&A just so it jogs my memory later. Follow up with folks during breaks, all good things. Sometimes it is they mention a citation you're not familiar with or something. You can go, could you remind me so I can write that down, and actually go look it up and improve it. That's all great, all great practices. Anything more to add on sort of our differences here between conference seminar papers versus articles section?
Just as a note that we will be talking in the last section of today's talk about building out network, and I think this is one of the best ways to do it, I guess, is like using those notes from Q&A as a workshop opportunity that you have with somebody who is also engaged in your research, who wants to ask questions and be involved. So yeah, just as a small point about that, but we'll probably talk about that a little bit more later.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that we're talking a lot about conference papers, but we're also mentioning, a lot of times grad students in particular might have a really good paper that came out of a seminar. It says seminar papers right there. So it's not just about a Q&A session. It's also about taking to heart your professor's feedback and using them as a touch point to get some really good feedback for shaping it toward publication. It's very tempting sometimes to maybe think that you've, hit the nail on the head in a really cool term paper and you want to share it with the world, and then finding out that building an actual argument for the scholarly community is a really different experience. So, take to heart professorial feedback, but also don't hesitate to reach out to other people in that field or in that community for a second set of eyes, or a third or a fourth set of eyes, use things like, and we'll get into this again, like Will said at the end, use things like the Discord, the Ludo Discord, or if it's not a video game oriented paper, it's not just about this journal, but use folks in your field and use colleagues to tell you whether or not your argument is legible. Like, can I make sense of this even if I'm not a person in your field? Because you're writing not just for the inside group, right? But you're writing for everyone.
That's such a great point. And yeah, I think for me, I've often thought of like seminar papers being potential conference. But so for me, the seminar was often the first step, because that was something polished that I could then, make an abstract out of. But you're right, like they may not be the same thing at all. But one of my very first publication on Tetris was actually written for a Cold War seminar under Daniel Foster Lucier, and incredible editor, and I walked into it going, I don't really do music and politics. I don't know what I'm going to write about. Oh no. And so through the course of the class, I developed this Tetris thing and how interesting, the Russianness added to that, specifically when they released it in the US versus the European versions of the game. So that became that seminar paper. I then presented it at Ludo and then was invited to contribute it to kind of a Ludo proceedings in the soundtrack, from Tim Summers. And so that was my first publication. And a lot of it was thanks to Danielle's awesome editing of that, as I was turning it into an article. She was able to really help shape it because she had helped advise the seminar paper version of it. So, and that was before I had really built out as much of a network either. So, I was kind of relying on my professors then too. Yeah, that's such a good point. Thank you, Karen. Everybody. All right, second section here. Our specific publishing process, pipeline, and timeline. So the number one thing is we use Scholastica as our platform. I don't even remember the name of it. What was the one we had before Scholastica?
Manuscript Central or something.
That's it. I knew I'd recognize it when I heard it. Manuscript Central. But yeah, we use Scholastica now. That was a journal-wide thing. I believe UC Press subscribes to it, and it allows for manuscript management, the peer review system to kind of all be in one place instead of having to do it over email, which can be messy. So anybody that needs to submit, you'll want to make sure you have a Scholastica login. I'm a big fan of using like a password, like manager. We use 1Password in our house here, and then it can like help you generate new ones when you need to change them or whatever. It has them all kind of signed in for you, and you can just copy them in when you're logging into stuff. But you'll want an account there, so you would submit the article. It comes in to us at this stage. Thank you. At this stage, we ask that we have images and examples and things like that actually embedded into the document, like if it's just a Word doc, so that peer reviewers have them to look at and refer to. Later on, we do pull them back out, and sort of prepare them separately as we prepare the manuscript, on the press side. But that's after everything's been accepted. So early on, we want it in there. The biggest thing though is, we'll come back to this later with common mistakes. Make sure it doesn't have your name all over it, like a heading, or even citing your own work using first person. Put it in third person if you're going to refer to your own stuff, like your master's thesis or something. So we don't want that. We don't want the peer reviewers to be like, oh, I know this person, and now it's compromised. So anyway, when a submission comes in, the four of us see it. We all get a notification. Something has been submitted on Scholastica. Okay, great. And if it's new, we'll take a look at it. The four of us, we have a Discord that we use to organize a lot of this stuff, and we will discuss, hey, this thing just came in, and one of us will usually sort of take a lead on it, and do an initial look through just to determine basic suitability for peer review, versus a desk reject. So a desk reject is basically we get something sent to us that is like not at all suitable for the journal content. An example that happened this year was somebody sent us a headphone review piece, And while of course you can use headphones in gaming, that wasn't really the way. It was just a tech review. It wasn't really like linking it to the listening experience in gaming or something like that. And so that sort of felt like more of like something that should be in a trade publication, not really suitable for this journal. And so that, for example, is a desk reject to us, something that just like doesn't fit the scope. We could desk reject for, I don't know, another reason, like it would have to just, where we assume that if we sent this out, there's no way that the reviewers would recommend publication. If we assumed that everybody would, send it back with a reject, this really isn't ready. It may happen at that stage too. But most of the time, a desk reject is going to be for scope. Um, and if we personally felt like maybe we wanted to reach out, maybe it was a student and a first submission, we may reach out and ask to do a little bit more one-on-one discussion with that person before we actually get to the stage of sending it out. But let's assume it comes in. It seems pretty solid, fits the scope of the journal. One of us says, "Okay, I'll take that article that just came in on Devil May Cry." I don't know why that was the example that came to my head. Uh, Devil May Cry article just came in. Okay, great. One of us will take it. We also have a peer reviewer brainstorming channel in the Discord where we'll go, okay, who's worked on semiotics in general, or they're talking about semiotics in Devil May Cry. So we'll try to find people that would be an interesting fit. And the system will show us when they've reviewed for us at all, if they have. And so we can maybe not tap the same person too frequently, because it is a lot of labor. And we do so much appreciate that folks do this for us. So want to make sure we sort of spread out the expertise a little bit and get different points of view on these. So we'll discuss the potential peer reviewers. And then whoever is kind of our lead editor will invite peer reviewers through Scholastica. And the ask will definitely it will say something along the lines of, we ask you to return it, and it will be like post dated 2 months. But that could wiggle a little bit depending on how long it takes them to accept it. So the same two peer reviewers might be, a week off of each other. But hopefully they're in the same ballpark, and we do try to coordinate that. We have had folks turn us down because they're like, I have a different deadline, I can't make it. And so we will, sort of, you can expect 2-ish months, but it could be a little more depending on trying to find people to say yes. So if we are having trouble getting people to say yes, that could slow down the start of that process. But yeah, then once they accept, they obviously read it. They have a form they fill out with commentary. They also have a kind of Likert scale section where it will kind of 1 to 5, how good does this fit the scope of the journal? How original is the research presented? Like, is this a novel contribution? That type of stuff. And they evaluate it on those terms. They also can give general feedback as well. They get that back to us. Sometimes they get it back early. Sometimes they get it back on a pretty quick turnaround. Other times they're a little late, and it does auto remind them, which is nice. The system will do that. Once they send it back, then let's see. Yeah. What happened? We may get them back, and then the editor on it is going to evaluate those reviews. So we're going to see what they said, and is it pretty common to have accept for both? No. I would say most common is you might get one that says, like, oh yeah, I would accept this with minor revisions. It's usually not a full, like, this is perfectly polished, full accept. It could happen, but most commonly you might get one of those and maybe a revise and resubmit, or 2 revise and resubmits. That is the most common thing for folks to get, just to make sure that it is polished as can be. It's the best form of itself it can be before it goes on. But let's say we get one back, and this has happened. Let's say we get one back where somebody says, accept with minor revisions. This is awesome. I can't wait to see it in print. Just a few little things, see my notes. And then the second one says, reject, this has no place being in this journal. What do you do? What do we do? Well, we have to decide who we agree with, right? Go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, I wasn't sure if that was an actual question to one of us.
I mean, sure. Yeah. What do we do?
If we get a person one reviewer who's an absolute no and another person who's an absolute yes, several things could happen. One, the editorial board taps in and we kind of feel out whether we lean more in one direction or the other. Do we find ourselves agreeing more with reviewer one or reviewer two? If we really, really feel the reject person, for example, noticed something that reviewer one just missed and it actually really is kind of egregious. Oh, wow, we really can't move forward with this. Okay, then we have our answer, right? If we're more like, there's merit here, maybe reject person's a little too harsh, or we're not entirely sure that we agree with that person, we might go forward with just reviewer one's information, or in many cases, what we'll end up doing is finding a tiebreaker and finding a third or even a fourth additional reviewer with a clean slate. They don't know any of the backstory. We don't ask them to be a tiebreaker per se, but we say, could you please review this for us? And we figure out if maybe that person is leaning more in one direction or another. And, we feel our way forward on a case by case basis, depending on what the nature of the commentary is and how we see ourselves in alignment with those ideas.
Yeah, beautifully stated. I have said a few times because I had one of these happen over the summer. I read the reject, and the reject felt more like a revise and like they were suggesting big revisions, but not untenable where like you would have to scrap the whole paper. At least from my perspective as I was reading them. And then the other one was accept with minor revisions. And so I said, well, sort of the average of those two is just a revise. Like, so I basically took the middle of that as a revise and resubmit, but absolutely we could bring in another person. Um, and that has happened. So never fear. There are, the editorial oversight should hopefully help facilitate this. The other thing that can happen, which is really nice to know, is that we actually control what you see of your reviewers' words. So let's say the reject person is really cruel and harsh and maybe not as constructive in the way they have phrased things. We can withhold that entirely and instead, like I would write something maybe summarizing. I did find some constructive things in here. Here was what was said, but we can withhold that from the author. And that actually happened to me on my Tetris article. I had this exact scenario happen in my very first publication, and the one was accept, like this is great, can't wait, and the other one, and this was not withheld from me, unfortunately. The other one called it unpublishable trash. And somehow that got sent to me. But Tim basically was like, we don't agree. but here's the full commentary so that you can kind of glean there are useful things to revise in this. And then I had to take it to my advisor and be like, help. I don't know what to do with this. And he sort of helped me, set the ego aside, not be too hard because it's hard to see, right? Somebody say mean things, but we were able to find really good kernels of things and then work on it from there. So we can technically withhold it. And we might say like I would probably have a little like sidebar with that person and just be like, ooh, text, this came across pretty harsh. That's the thing about text versus an in-person conversation. We don't have all of those nonverbal cues and the body language and all those things that could soften some of that. For the most part, our reviewers are great and very constructive. And I think, do it as a labor of love and really do want to see high quality material and want to see the work itself kind of be at its best form. So this is not like a common thing, but it is good to be aware. So often things are revise and resubmit. So it is rare to have full accept on first submission. It could happen, but I don't think it's the norm. So revisions would then happen. The author, it's kind of contingent on how long it takes the author to revise. We say ideally within 2 to 3 months, but life happens. They have other deadlines. Sometimes things don't get turned around. We just kind of leave it inactive until we see it again. So we'd like to see them revise and get it back in the pipeline and move it forward, but it sort of depends on the author at that point. So yeah, ideally within 2 to 3 months, they resubmit it. And we then will typically send the revision back out to peer reviewers to ensure critiques were addressed adequately. So if I had somebody that was accept, I probably wouldn't send it back to them. But if I had an R&R, I may just have them do a quicker read through, not as in depth as the peer review in the first time, and just sort of like, hey, do you feel like this met some of your original critiques? And then they can say, yeah, this looks substantially, better, and I think it's ready now, or it made superficial changes, but it's not really addressing the major concern. So we kind of work with them at that point as well. It could go back out for another R&R. That does happen. It kind of depends on how the revisions take place. Um, if all is well, then we move it to accept. And then we move to manuscript preparation at that point. So some of the things we need for that: a publishing agreement, which is just a form from the press that says, yes, UC Press may publish this article, and has your name and the title of the article and some of your info on there. So they have to have those on file for anything that goes through, including even like editorial. We had an editorial just go through where I had to sign a publishing agreement for the 4 of us. So you'll see that in 6.4 here shortly. I think it's going to publish by the end of the month-ish. So publishing agreement. We'll collect an updated bio, because of course that can change from the start of submission to the end. So short bio, we don't have a hard and fast rule on this. We generally say, I don't know, like ish 150 words, could be more, 3 to 4 sentences. Feel free to use whatever stock bio you're using. Abstract for it. I like the 250 as a rule, just to have that. So they'll publish that as in the header, and also use that for search engine optimization for searchability, and similarly keywords. 3 to 6 is recommended by our submission guidelines, but it could be more. And then at that point, images, examples, videos, audio, any of those examples are going to get pulled out and kind of put into their own folder. So whereas embedded into a Word document, they might just be like kind of small, low quality. We do want, I think it's a 600 DPI minimum, between 600 and 1200 DPI. So we want to get as high quality of an image as we can just for reproducibility. So we want them to look really good at about 5.5 to 6 inches wide. And then you can obviously have pretty high res images depending on the game you're playing. Some earlier games, even at your highest possible, fidelity, highest possible resolution of image capture, you may not be at 600. So for like NES games, you may not be at 600, but it may kind of visually pass the test and look crisp and good even at that blown up size. So that is mostly for certainly any photograph images, kind of more modern games. We just don't want things too grainy or pixelated. So we do pull those out separate, make sure that those are high enough quality as we need them. And then we create a document separate from the article that contains all of the captions in order. So figure 1, caption. Figure 2, caption. Audio 1, caption. And then with that, we will also include alt text for all examples. This was the press this year added a accessibility guidelines where they asked us to have alt text for any and all examples, including things like audio and video. And so we tell folks, I think Stephanie made a point here in our meeting, it makes sense to wait on alt text until this point because things could get moved around, revised, cut between submissions. So it's always a good thing to make sure that we get that toward the end. And then this step may also involve further suggestions from the editorial team and or the copy editors at the press itself that are employed by the press. So they are separate from us, but about wording, language, formatting issues. So this can take a few weeks. Sometimes something is ready kind of well before we need it. So the manuscript preparation is kind of happening as we are coming up on a deadline for an issue. So we may have one that's ready and it just kind of waits to get slotted in and final formatting until closer to where we know we're going to put it. So accept doesn't mean it's necessarily automatically going in the next issue. It kind of depends how it's shaping out. And we try to not promise, oh, this will be in 7 too. We don't always know. Basically, until we're preparing the manuscript, then we can say, okay, this is going to be in 7 too, because you never know. Things do get moved around or have to move around. All right, so then manuscript submission is handled by us. So we may ask for stuff like captions, alt text from you, but the actual kind of final formatting and then the submission of the volume issue as a whole is by us. So they get a big folder that has everybody's, like, here's all 4 pieces that are going to be in this issue. So that gets handled by us. The next thing that the author will see is an email from the copy editorial team at the press. And this will include their now like mocked up proofs for how it will look in print. And then at that point, they usually ask for like a 3 business day turnaround. They want you to just kind of look through them, make sure there aren't glaring errors. This isn't the time for major corrections, but instead small things like formatting, punctuation. There was a really fun one in Jillian Grasso has an article here in 6.4 where they hyphenated across a line break, and it was soundscape, but it was sounds cape instead of soundscape, and so it looked funny to have cape on its own line, and so she just asked, like, could we move the one letter to the other, if we have to split across a line, could we just like make that a little less silly, so that like you can ask for stuff like that. Yeah. um yeah, we'll come back to that in a moment. That's a really good point there. So yeah, you can have like little edits. We had one, oh, these are actually the wrong keywords. That's from a different article. So like, here's the keywords we need, stuff like that. So you mark that up in like an Adobe Acrobat in comments. So you don't actually make we're not in like track changes Word. It has to just be kind of plopped on top of the document so the copy editor sees it really clearly, because they can miss it otherwise if it was any other form of manipulating the document. So it's all like commentary right where it goes. So then they will make those changes, turn them back around to just the editorial team. And then we basically then, at that point, to not delay things any further, we look through it and make sure that we have your things answered for, that yes, the changes you asked to be made have been made. And so the final proofs are signed off by the editorial team. Article goes to print. You are sent a digital copy by the press as the article goes live, usually a PDF that you can have for your own records. And it goes live, and you'll have the link and be able to share it and celebrate, post on your social media, all those things. Let's go back to this point though in the chat here, because it's fantastic and important to have. So Stephanie and Karen here talking about images. So Stephanie, go ahead and just sort of say it for the aggregate here.
Yeah, I was just popping in the chat that just to clarify, it's the author who has to actually make each of the little images for the figures at the resolution that Dana was talking about. Mainly because, there's use so many different software for creating these things that we can't ensure like cross compatibility on our end. So this way, make sure that it looks exactly like what you want. But we may bounce it back to you if the resolution is not quite where it wants to be. And then Karen replied and also reminded everyone that it's authors' responsibilities as well for clearing copyright.
Yes.
And that's just to jump in on that. That's actually kind of hit or miss sometimes if we're talking specifically about video games, because there's always the question of whether an author-generated screenshot is fair use. And I think right now we are leaning toward yes, but some other journals or publications might not agree with that. So when in doubt, if you're working with us or a different journal or publisher, just always verify what counts as fair use and what you legitimately need to do to make sure you have the right to use a particular image. So we're kind of in gray territory with some kinds of media. And the same thing comes like a film scholarship. If you're doing a screenshot of a movie or a film, is it cool because you own the DVD? What happens if you get it off YouTube? Who owns it, right? So there are all sorts of kind of wibbly wobbly things there. So when in doubt, just talk to us or your other editors or whoever about that.
Yeah. And I think in terms of fair use, some important things to think about are um, necessity of the example. How central is it that you have this versus being able to just describe it? That's happened on the animation book where we couldn't get permission for a certain image and an author had to just explain around, not because they couldn't get that permission to use the image. So making sure that like it's important that it's in here relating to what we're talking about. It's not just pretty screenshot of the game because I like the game that I wrote on. There has to be a reason that that specific screenshot is being used. Of course, fair use also has to do a bit with the bottom line of the publisher, the originator, the ones that own the rights to whatever it is. So I can't just publish a recording I own on my YouTube, right? Because somebody could stumble upon my upload of this Mozart piano sonata that is not something I performed, right? It's some other person's performance. And so at that point, I'm taking views away from the actual creators and the ones that own the publishing for that. And then ad revenue gets moved to me instead of them. And so they have the right to strike a copyright claim on that. And they on YouTube, they have ability to get it taken down. They can also say, well, no, I want their ad revenue, and if they have a valid claim to that, they can just take your ad revenue. So they can sort of get the money from it if they see value in leaving it up and having kind of like more opportunities for ears and eyes on it. So when it comes to something like a video game, audio example, we probably wouldn't want to do the whole track out of a soundtrack or something like that, but a snippet used for sort of these explanatory purposes, for analysis, for making your academic point is more likely to be valid and valued as fair use because it's sort of not a replacement for the experience of listening to the original off a soundtrack album or in the game itself. So it's just some things to think about with fair use. Like at any point, Nintendo could get mad, right? And they could come after stuff and they would have full right to do that. But in the gray area as it exists right now, generally things like that are okay if they are transformative. You are performing this analysis and transcription and discussion upon the work, and you only kind of use as much as you need to make that point. So you're not going to have 3 pages of a score, right? just a few measures here is much more likely to not be a problem. So excellent. Okay. Oh, I actually had 2 of these. Anyway, forgot I had split that across 2 slides. Okay. Next section is best practices, and we've been kind of getting into this as we go, but here we'll be a little more specific. Our
Question, if that's all right.
Please.
In terms of like, we were just talking about like copyright and permissions and everything. Have there been many situations or any that you know of in which like someone is working with an independent developer and is in contact with them and they can provide those permissions? Is that something that we ever see? Yeah, that's my question.
I can answer that because I've done that. Yeah, when I wrote my book, actually, I wrote directly to each of the copyright holders to request for the copyright permission. And in most cases with the indie developers, they wrote back and said yes. So it is possible to reach out and get those permissions.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a pretty basic like form letter. We even had to do one. We have a translation here in 6.4 from Dominic Arsenault, and had to just do a quick rewrite to the original French language journal, just saying, hey, can we print a translation of this? We will link the original, like we will drive traffic back to you as best as we're able, but then also increase that accessibility to that French language publication by having the English version. And we have a nice little letter in French in the file that's just like, yes, this translation can be printed. We are okay with that. So reprints of existing work can be kind of a different beast, but usually they can just write a simple letter and just say like, yes, this is used with permission, even just an email. For some things, like I don't know, somebody a performer's uh, arrangement of something. I'm trying to think. Like we might be able to get, permission to use a small snippet of that where like an email could suffice for that type of thing. It kind of depends on a case by case basis. So like anytime anybody has a question, like we would be working with you on that. Um, and then send you to go ask who you needed to ask if there were things like that. Okay. Excellent question though. Okay. Um, Here's a link. We have a living document here of the JSMG instructions for contributors. And this is kind of everything you would need for submissions, but also proposals for special issues and things like that. If you wanted to serve as an editor on a special issue, we have a few of those in process now. And we had several in this past volume. Some really good edited collections here. So the instructions for contributors are right there. In fact, let me open that up. I'm just gonna stick it into this window. Just drag it. And then I can kind of scroll through for us. Okay. Okay. Oh, no, don't full screen. Do not full screen. Stop that. Okay, just reposition the window. There we go. Okay, it's fiddly. It's fiddly. But so it has the editorial submission system. It has the Scholastica link right up top. This sections on what we publish, submitting your work, proposing a special issue, style guidelines, pretty much the bulk of the thing, reviews, peer review criteria. And these are all bookmarked, and then you can kind of go to them. So yes, our standard length articles 7 to 10, including footnotes, excluding bibliography, or short articles of 4 to 7, including footnotes, excluding bibliography. Generally, we try to stick to the 10, but that we also do welcome kind of non-traditional things. Um, so review articles, surveying important subjects, conference reports, position papers, practitioner perspectives are really great. Position papers, communications with responses, interviews. We are sort of open to different formats as well. We can also do translations, of course, as long as we have the rights and permissions to do so. And authors can propose reviews of things. We actually are in the process of informing and naming our our new editor here. We had a change in the editorial team here, so we have a new one coming in. So we'll be able to have folks talk to them to get reviews in the pipeline. And then the format is online. We are an electronic publication, so we can include things like videos, musical examples, instead of only static images. So we can use multimedia as well. But depending on what it is, we've had folks ask, can we do an entire just video submission? And we had to go to the press about that, because how do you do anonymity if the author is giving the video, right? And they had basically told us at that point you can sort of use like a transcript or a script of it for peer review purposes, where you can try to anonymize as best as possible, and then the actual video production can be separate from that. So it's definitely possible, but to kind of maintain the rigor and anonymity, it may be a little bit of a different process for a non-traditional thing. So at that point, we'd want folks to talk to us about it. So then Microsoft Word or PDF is what we recommend. I always like working in Word because of the editability. And then especially by the end, if I only have a PDF, I may need a Word document for the final formatting. So I like a Word document in this case. We do use footnotes and bibliography out of Chicago Manual of Style, and we do have a link to that. Prior to publication, we will have folks sign the author agreement. I usually email that directly to folks. Um, of course, anything anybody has in terms of questions, there's a lot of just ask us on here. Ensuring anonymity, important. Metadata is a big one. So we don't want acknowledgments, personal notes, references to previous exhibitions of the research, such as antecedent articles or conference presentations. Or if you do so, like, don't make it clear that it's, my continuation of it'd be like, see previous thing by Planck, right? So you anonymize it that way. So you can still cite yourself, but not in the first person. All right. Use of AI. This is new. The press has been, of course, watching what's happening and deciding what they want to do. So they do have their own guidelines. Our team reviewed it to determine whether we wanted to write anything different from that. In general, we were pretty happy with what they had, but the big one, notably the comp policy for content creators, reads, authors are responsible and legally accountable for the content of their work. AI tools may not be credited or attributed as an author on any work published by UC Press. Any content generated by AI does not meet the requirements of authorship. AI insisted improvements to human-generated text for readability, formatting, and style, and to ensure that the texts are free of errors in grammar, spelling, and punctuation and tone are permitted. However, authors who use AI tools to produce text or images, graphics, or to collect or process data must inform their editors of this use and be transparent about it in their manuscripts so that readers understand the role of these tools in the development of the work. The author is fully responsible for the entirety of their work. They must ensure that it is original, accurate, does not plagiarize others' work, and appropriately cites and references others' work, including any content that is generated by AI. And then they have a similar comment here about peer reviews, where they are strictly prohibiting it for the composition of peer review reports or feedback. Kind of takes the human out of it if they're not actually going to read your work and get you that feedback. So we can ask peer reviewers to declare the use of such tools, but we are generally not a fan in here. So it can, and one big issue being like if this person like loaded manuscript into an AI tool, that's a breach of copyright of the original author. So that's strictly prohibited by UC Press. So not a big fan. Abstract and keywords. I guess we say about 300 here. We're not super strict on word count for bio and abstract, I will say. It's kind of fitting to what the work needs. So you can get by with shorter as well. Abstract should summarize the argument, methodological approach of the article. See my Wombat workshops for more on this. I can link those soon. And then please include 3 to 6 keywords along with the abstract. We'll talk about that soon with best practices, things on proposing a special issue, and then all of our guidelines, footnotes, quotation, style, language. So we don't have to go exactly blow by blow through this, but just some good things to be aware of. We do tend to do that system where you do a full citation of a source the first time you use it, and then if you keep referring to it, then you would go to the short form citation, last name, shortened version of the title, page number. And we no longer, as per Chicago, use like the idem citations. We actually do repeat the name and or title. And this includes in the bibliography where we used to have the dashes for subsequent same citations by the same person. They're more in favor now of having the author re-spelled out every single time, even if you're citing multiple things by them. Okay. And I don't follow this too closely myself. It basically is like, don't have your footnotes get too out of hand in terms of asides, right? Explanations, supplementary information, storytelling, Easter eggs. I like a little bit of that personally, just stylistically. I think it's fun because I like reading people's footnotes. But, we don't want the thing where you have like half the page is the footnotes. That's silly. Like, does that really need to be there? What could be in the main text? Keep them tidy and user friendly. Quotations, how to introduce them, using square brackets for editorial interventions, like if you're explaining something or adding in a noun that maybe was an unclear referent in the context of the original quote. So you say what the thing is instead of it. You would use a square bracket. Ellipses for omissions. Sic, if necessary, to indicate accurate transcriptions, otherwise it would get flagged as an error, that kind of thing. Original ellipses should be indicated as such, etc. So like everybody can go through these. Style and language pretty much follows Chicago. A lot of very specific examples in here as well. So text formatting and headings. And they have all your like double spaced, flush left, normal plain font, 12 point, etc. Musical notes and symbols. We have asked our editors generally prefer to actually write out like E flat instead of putting a flat symbol in Unicode, just because it can affect the line spacing. And so we have had folks ask to do that, and generally in the like captions and in the images, like that might be there, but in the text they sort of prefer for us to not do the flat and sharp symbols, but we do have the possibility of indicating that for typesetter at that point. Okay. Images and captions. Yeah, this is where we have our info about what the sizes will be. This is obviously important toward the end of the process, but kind of good to have, but like as you're developing the project earlier, because if you only have like a really terrible, spotty image, and then you go to later on go find it again, it's just nice to be working in a decent resolution and DPI from the beginning, so that you don't have to go back and track those. You ever like have a quotation and then you forget to write down what page number, and then you're like digging through the book again to be like, crud, what page was that on? I'm using this quote now, I don't know where it is. It's kind of like that, but with images. So we don't want that. And again, older video game materials, it may not be possible to get the quality they're asking for, but we do it as best as we can. We also prefer screenshots from the authors, just again for the fair use thing. Like, it's a whole thing if you're taking somebody else's screenshot off YouTube. That's just a whole other can of worms. Also makes it harder to get the highest quality for that. Maybe they didn't upload it 4K or something, and that can make it kind of difficult. All right, and then specifics for video and audio as well, and then all of our accessibility requirements with some best practices for alt text. So this is something that we would send people to, as it's getting accepted and kind of prepared for final submission. And this is all new language from UC Press that they had us incorporate into this document. And they do have best practices here for using color and contrast. There are online checkers that can do that and ensure that things are contrasty enough. Explaining what alt text is, that alternative text describes visual content of images, charts, and tables for visually impaired readers, that screen readers would then be able to play the text aloud and describe what's in the image. And so there's some do's and don'ts here. I will say the alt texting processes for images are a lot more robust, and tables and things like that. And so they do have, what should you do to format all of these? But they may also ask us for audio descriptions as well of speech and non-speech audio information needed to understand the content. And you will see, look how short that section is. A transcript or audio description is required to accompany all audio files. This is not as robust in terms of best practices anywhere. I say if there's speech, have a transcript of the actual speech in the snippet. If there is a musical example, describe it just the way we would a notation example in the text. So you might, depending on what you're talking about, Ryan's article that just came up, he was talking about timbre. So we were focusing on timbre because he felt like in this case, to understand why this is here, we don't necessarily need the chord progression that's happening underneath because he was describing the specific timbre of this like Super Nintendo instrument, in the software, and sort of the compression to it and the specific sound of it. So like that's what we need to be able to apprehend it in a non-texted example. So that's something that you can work with us. We have a feel for. I also have a feeler out to the AMS Music and Disability Studies group about potentially doing a workshop or developing our own set of best practices for musical alt texting, because this is something that across the board doesn't have as robust support. And the press certainly is just like, have alt text. They don't really have strong guidelines yet. So we may help them in developing that. And same thing with video formatting. I think it's newer that journals are able to support these. And so I think that that's part of why they're just not as developed yet. And there's a ton of accessibility resources linked. There's examples given of alt texting, which is nice for the different types of examples. So they do have a musical example describing what's happening as it's necessary for understanding what's going on. Section here on permissions. They have their own UC Press guidelines about how to do that. And then some sample citations and bibliography and whatnot. All right. Oh, and then also just like some of our standard spellings for things, chip music as one word, gameplay as one word, cutscene, things like that. Because we get asked about that. Video game music, don't hyphenate video game as a compound modifier, stuff like that. All right, and then a section on reviews, an example of our rubric for reviewers, which is landscape pages. So all good stuff. It's a nice, robust, long document here. Yeah, I mean that's what we have, and we're happy to change it if folks hate it. Like I don't have a strong opinion on Sound World as one word. I've mostly seen it as one word, but it could be because that's what the journal has had as the standard here. Okay. So it is a living document. We updated it this year with the AI stuff, and we updated it with the accessibility guidelines and the requirement for the alt text, because that was not required until this year. All right, best practices. We need an abstract, and we need keywords. So if we can say some things for abstracting, but for keywords, it's easy to just say, remember that this is about getting people to find your article when searching. So 3 to 6 are mentioned in submission guidelines. So the types of keywords you might consider are things like names of the games or franchises you discuss. Major methodologies or approaches. So you might have neo-Riemannian analysis, topic theory, queer studies. You may have those as one of your like keyword sets. Trying to think what else. I think it would just vary based on topic there. Could be composer names, performer names. If you were focusing on, I don't know, Jun Chikuma, for example, as Karen has done brilliantly, then that would be a good keyword, because somebody searching for something on Jun Chikuma would find the Fazanadu article, right? Abstracts, I like to tell people, like, same thing when you're proposing for a conference, like, don't be too precious about telling us your conclusion. Don't save the good stuff. Don't think like, I'll just hook them and then they'll be wowed. They'll read it in the article. Like, you have to give it away. The sciences, this is like so basic. Like they say this was what was done, this was what was found, and then of course they have a method of writing that out, and it's a bit boilerplate. In our field, because like the writing is such a craft side of the humanities, I think folks, they're like, well, what if they, I don't know, don't want to don't want to then read it. But like there's beauty in the art of actually explicating that argument, outlining it, getting us there, walking us through that garden path to the actual conclusion. But not having that in an abstract means it's less likely that somebody's going to look at that and go, "Oh yeah, I'm going to use that in my next project. I'm going to cite you." You want to think about folks being able to find it and cite it and utilize it in their papers and up your citation count. So if you have too vague of material in your abstract, then that could make it so that somebody is less likely to click through and then want to read or download the article and go from there. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in on other. I have a lot of best practices for abstracts, so I'm like trying to not just wombat here. I can like wombat at some point.
I don't have anything to suggest, but I'll just flag that we're getting a little bit long on time at this point.
Yeah. Sounds good. Okay. Um, citation best practices. We have the Chicago guide linked in the guide itself, but here is also a quick guide that we will link here. Great. All right. We had don't cite things that aren't directly referred to. You can have a footnote like for further reading, go see XYZ. But one common issue is making sure, like, especially as something evolves and things get cut or changed, things referred to in the text should be in the bibliography. Things in the bibliography should be in the text, and checking for that alignment. This can get overlooked when editing and cutting out material from a larger thesis chapter and things like that. All right. And then finally, collaborative work, co-authoring, footnotes of gratitude. So while at initial submission, you might not have all of your like acknowledgments of assistance and support and things. These are best practices to have in a final version, kind of acknowledging all of the folks that contributed to it. And as somebody who's done just a little bit of collaborative work and definitely wants to be doing more co-authoring, I love that. I think it's a wonderful thing to find people that you can do that work with and celebrate it, and both get to be listed as authors and have it on your CV, and you get the benefit of multiple heads coming together. Difference between Chicago and Turabian. Well, Turabian is no longer being updated for one. Chicago is the standard. So we're current edition Chicago. Yeah. Turabian was originally kind of a simplification of Chicago, a straightforward, practical guide. But Chicago is a living style guide. So common in the humanities. All right. Common mistakes. Forgetting to anonymize submissions. Oh, and this can, man, if we only have like a PDF, this can be such a thing. We can't always remove stuff on our end. And that could really slow you down. Anonymize your submission. Because, oh boy, and if we miss it and it goes to peer review and the peer reviewer goes, by the way, the person left their name in it, that's a can of worms, because then, okay, do we have to find entirely new peer reviewers? Do we have to scrap the, what do we do? That's a problem. So we really need to anonymize the submissions. That is important for upholding the rigor of the peer review process. We need that anonymity on both sides, right? Identifying info, where you might be referring to other work of yours, things like that. Remove any headers with your name and institution, that type of stuff. All right. Inappropriate citations, or lack of citations to important literature. So sometimes folks are just throwing everything but the kitchen sink in their citations in a desire to seem well-read, but like make sure that your citations actually do have a place there and they're not just there to be there. And also that you're not missing important literature. One of the most common reasons something may be sort of prevented from going forward with peer review, or we say, hey, this needs more mentoring going on, would be like you're writing on leitmotif or topic theory and you're not citing major leitmotif or topic theory work. Like you're taking it almost as a given. Or you're writing about, I don't know, Majora's Mask and you don't cite Elizabeth Benina Gray. Like if there is existing work, especially in video game music, and you haven't found it on on the major, check your JSTOR, check your realm, right? Check your rhythm. Find the abstracts, find the keywords. Check the SSSMG bibliography if somebody wants to link that. Yes, that's a really good place to just go by keyword and make sure like who else has written on these things. And just because somebody else has written on a Zelda doesn't mean it's necessarily germane to your take on a specific Zelda game that isn't that one, but it is nice to acknowledge that you are aware of it and that you have read it. When we don't see that type of due diligence, it can, it can be awkward. And it can be a sign that other things aren't as careful as they need to be. Clunky, awkward prose, proofread, get other people to proofread. Make sure that we don't have those types of errors. Failure to clearly state your thesis or provide appropriate conclusions. Again, you can have some preliminary stuff in a conference paper or seminar paper, but by this stage, we want it to be more polished. Core structure being unclear can be an issue. Don't save the good stuff for the end. Make sure there's a through line. Make sure that it hangs together in the way that you are taking us through the material. I always like kind of a funnel where I start broader with like lit review, and then I may build down to a case study. That can be a very elegant way to do it. But that's just one way of formatting something. But that's a very clear structure that's easy to follow. All right. Anybody else have any common mistake things to add before we end on our final topic? Cool. All right. My favorite section, building out your network. So along with avoiding all of these common mistakes and doing your best practices, we're all about collaboration and building out the network. So this is applicable to everybody, not just students and recent grads, but we're maybe earlier on still building out that professional circle, not processional. I do a lot of weddings, so processional comes up a lot. Professional circle of mentors. Finding writing circles and working groups. Who's going to look something over for you before it even gets submitted as an article. Seeking out critique in advance of submission from colleagues and mentors can save a lot of time later on. They can catch big issues and catch them early before submitting and getting a reject or an R&R or multiple rounds of R&R. So this can really be an incredible time saving for someone. So finding writing circles and working groups can be a little easier if there is like a dissertation writing group in your campus and then you just join it. But a lot of us don't find as much motivation in those kind of general ones. So building your own can be really important. So where do you do that? You go to Ludo sessions at AMS, SMT, SEM. You attend the major conferences, the North American Conference on Video Game Music, Ludo. You could go to things like Game Sound Con, which has an academic game studies track that Matthew Thompson and I run, where you'll see a few of us, and that's on the West Coast. Certainly, regional conferences that incorporate media studies, you might go to any of these, right? The Ludo Musicology Study Group has a writing group. Excellent. So glad to hear that. So that people can be working things up together. Of course, the Ludo Discord too is a nice hub for folks. Putting yourself out there is so scary, but you already have common ground. You go to these conferences, that somebody at NACFAGUM is another game person, and you can just build a genuine friendship. I really hated in undergrad when they would talk about networking, and it always felt so transactional. What do you get from this other person? And it's such the wrong approach, because people hate that feeling of kind of being approached only for what they can give you. Whereas if you just focus on, hey, I'm going to make a friend in the field and like be able to have this really robust relationship and these inspiring conversations with them that drive me to want to work and create something, and then I can get their opinion on. That's such a more genuine relationship. That's so important. So being able to start these conversations can be scary, but we're doing so with people who share our passions. We have that common ground. We mentioned, I don't know if there's a link or there was a on our outline it said Young Scholars Mentorship Program, SMT, question mark. Is that still, did we determine that still exists? I think so. But
Link
yeah, go ahead.
incoming potentially. Hold up.
Oh, nice. There's also reaching out to local chapters of things like the AMS to see some of them have programs where they will pair you with a senior scholar as you work on your first article. And it will be like a pre-mentor peer review situation, which can be really good if you're in an environment where maybe you're doing games work, but your advisor is great, but like doesn't really know video games or something. That happens to a lot of us. You may not be in an environment where you're studying with a ludomusicologist, so it can be good to find that person to give you that specific critique, even if your advisor is a great editor, right? Having this reciprocity of building trust by doing this for other people, being a good citizen, saying yes when they ask you to read their stuff, and make it clear that you want it to be a reciprocal thing, and not just you asking all the time to have your work looked at. Be a good citizen, be a part of that process, be a part of helping other people's work improve. And it's so important in these relationships. I think of it almost like chamber music critique and sitting in what am I looking at? Masterclass. Like when you're sitting in a masterclass and critique is being given, and it's so hard not to take it personally. Music making, writing about music, scholarship is often something that we put a lot of our own identity into. And so it can be really hard to have critique of that. You can get attached to certain things and somebody thinks it's superfluous. They want to knock out something that you think is like a part of your voice. That's so hard. But so I think it's really important to sort of separate it out, know that it's not personal, that peer critique is a huge gift that you give each other, and to assume best intentions. Even when somebody is trying to tell me, like, I think you need to completely scrap this and just like start it again from this other angle. The times that I have done that and just said, like, I'm gonna not let ego get in the way here. I'm just gonna try it. I've been so happy with the results, and I've been so grateful that somebody took that much time to like give me that specific of feedback, because that means they really spent some time with it. So I really appreciate that. So it's not personal. Peer critique is a gift, and in general, they're saying it because they do like your work and they really want to. They think there's a really good seed there, and they want to see something grow out of it. And then finally, when you get that beautiful gift of that, don't ignore the feedback. That's the number one reason something will go back for multiple rounds of R&R is addressing reviewer comments in too superficial of a way. Like they're just like, oh, I just want to get this over with, and they don't really dig into the meat of the changes. And that doesn't mean that you also let them steamroll you. You don't necessarily have to do every single thing that's recommended by the peer reviewer, and you can assert yourself a little bit, but if there's no substantive engagement with it, like it's unlikely to move forward because it's going to feel like nothing has been done. It has not improved. Okay. I appreciate that, Andrew. Yeah, never forget that your colleagues are investing their time, energy, and beliefs in you because they value your work and opinion. It is not truly coming from a good place and intended to make your work and your future. It is coming from a good place and intended to make your work and your future work better. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Just assuming the best intentions. So, anybody else have any additions here? I will move us then to questions. Yeah, it is the power of friendship. It's the real articles, the friends we made along the way. All right, questions. This is a lot of material, a lot of resources. We will link everything as well.
I do have two questions. One that's a little bit more general, and the other one might be situational to me. Um, so I'm looking at the, images and captions on the instructions for contributors document, and notice that there is verbiage about the date of incorporating the date you took the screenshot. Is that a necessity, or is that something that's like you should
It's
offer
more,
that if you have that?
I think it's more of a best practice.
Okay.
I haven't really seen that. My other editors can go with me on that. I haven't really seen that come up as an issue.
It's up and down about whether that gets included or not.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think a lot of sometimes it will be important to the argument that you're trying to make, but
Sure.
sometimes less so. So I think
Okay.
use good judgment and give as much information as you can that makes sense.
Cool.
And as an example, where would it be necessary? Are you studying an MMO, right? Like then the date you took the screenshot matters. So it is situational to what you're looking at. So
Cool.
if you're doing a single player console game, yes, there can be patches and stuff, and that could be the reason that is in there is sort of that record of, you know, which version of this. But MMO, it might be really valid to say like this was taken on this date on this
Good to
server or
know.
whatever. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Second question is kind of going back way to the beginning about descriptions of figures and prose versus in an image. Um, uh, in case, so the context is I'm adapting a thesis chapter into an article, and running into a lot of issues with word count. And one recommendation I received was taking out some of that the prose description and instead including videos, which I already had included a lot of videos without the prose. So wasn't sure if there are any recommendations on if there's like a maximum amount of videos I can incorporate, or yeah, it's a little bit of a situation of I want to make sure I'm under that word count, and that was one recommendation, was to remove some of that written description.
Mm-hmm.
I can maybe speak a bit to that.
Yeah, do it.
We've had a bit of back and forth conversation with the publisher about this, just about in what situations we can incorporate video, you know, can we do video only submissions? One of the things that they flagged for us is that the ultimate version that they end up publishing is oftentimes accessed as PDF. So typically you want enough in the prose that they can still get the gist of what the argument is. And then the videos, you know, when people are looking at the web version of it, they have that as the supplementary resource to be able to watch. But you need to sort of keep in mind that they may not always have access to that video.
That is good to know. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah, and for something like that is like you let your editorial team here have a sneak peek at stuff before you go into Scholastica and submit, and like we will happily look through it and talk over with you, or even set up a meeting for stuff like that if we needed to, because yeah, we may have different takes on like how to get that under, because I know I know it's a lot. Excellent.
I have a quick question about scope and the assumptions we make about the readership. There's some stuff I'm working on that is like video game scholarship, but also super heavy, like transformational theory stuff. Um, is there, I mean, especially for the theorists on the board, I'm curious if you have any opinions on like, is there any extent to which there is a feeling of like we should, you know, try to make sure our scholarship is accessible to a broader music research community? Or I mean, I don't mean to say like, oh, musicologists can't understand transformational theory, but yeah, I think
Can't.
the point of the question is more so that like being an interdisciplinary journal, to what extent might it be worthwhile to alter or kind of, I guess, yeah, how theory-y is too theory-y?
I'm probably a good person to answer that because I'm a transformational theorist, which you already know, but yeah. I would say like in my own work, when I've been working with this, it isn't it is a journal that does appeal to a cross section of people interested in ludo topics, right? But at the same time, I mean, if you are a theorist, there's a certain amount of that content that you need in order to be able to make your argument. One thing that I've been mindful of towards my own work is making sure that the descriptors are, you know, there's a way to do it with technical language, and there's also a way to do it with plain language that still gets the technical idea across. And I think when you're thinking about your audience, that's probably what you want to have in mind when you're doing that. You know, if you're having jargon in there, make sure you explain what the jargon actually means. If you're going into some hardcore math, maybe structure it so that it's more of an add-on rather than an essential to understanding the overall idea of the paper. if you're going to go the hardcore math way, you know, it's maybe another journal is the home for that, right? Like here, what I would say we're hoping to engage with is the broader Ludo community, who maybe can grab on to a part of that and have a, you know, find it really enriching.
Thank you.
And I'd always welcome it as one of those musicologists that maybe doesn't do, maybe even understand transformational theory. I love the idea of having stuff that is really high level, but I do think that there is a way to sort of bring us into it, even if I'm not catching every single bit of the math, right? So you know, work with somebody like Stephanie. You know, find somebody that you know can do that gut check for you as you're working on a submission.
My disadvisor's scared of the mass too, and so I said, "Hey, I'll make it so that everybody's on board."
So you're probably well on the way then to what you would need. Excellent. All right. Of course, you can reach the team pretty easily. We can drop preferred email addresses in chat here, and then we also have the what is it, JSMG at sssmg.org. That's the email address, right? So that one kind of goes to the. Oops, I did not mean to direct message that. Hold on. All right, so yeah, we have our main one, and then we have our individual. You can always reach out to us individually as well. We're always really happy to chat with folks in advance of submissions, or just kind of be aware something might be coming. Take a preliminary look, you know, recommend people that you know you might want to talk to, things like that. So yeah, and then before we disband, I'm gonna quickly hand over the mic to Thomas Yee.
Hello, everyone. This was a great webinar, and I'm going to kind of talk about another one real quick. So, as on behalf of the AMS Ludomusicology Study Group, which I co-chair with some other officers that are present here, we are launching a series of webinars called Level Up Together, which is basically sort of professional, and it's sort of like the How to Academic channel in the main Ludo Discord. And we're launching our first session next Friday, so a week from today, also featuring our wonderful Dana Plank. And it'll be on writing successful conference and book chapter proposals. So I think a lot of on that like early slide that was, you know, the difference between an article and a conference paper, will sort of bring that out, but maybe from the other end, and it'll bring back some greatest hits from like the Wombat series and things like that. So that will be next Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Central. Next Friday on October 24th. So I'll post in the Ludo Discords, the big one and the AMS, to send out that information, so you'll have it.
Excellent. Yeah, looking forward to that. We'll get in the weeds with the wombatty stuff. It'll be good. Great. So thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate it, and we will stop the recording and get it. Once I have it, I will upload it to my YouTube. I will send out the link so that folks have this as a resource, and then we can share from there.